and welcome. Thank you for joining us once more for this panel. We're going to be talking, as you can see, about supply chains, heading for new shores, diversification and partnership will define the way. I want to welcome the audience that we still have with us in Dubai, and also a large contingent joining us online for this cross-continental conference, which is happening in both Dubai and in London, and our virtual audience is stationed all over the world. With that, a reminder that we encourage you, the audience, to get involved. Please do send in your questions. I have with me an iPad, so I receive all the questions that I will weave into this conversation as we go along. Try and get them in early so that we don't miss out on some of your really insightful thoughts and probing deeper into some of the issues we're going to discuss today. So we all know that global supply chains have been significantly disrupted over the last 2 years. They've been hit with COVID-19, of course, the pandemic, and now we also have geopolitical uncertainties to deal with. Now, there are some who say that during the pandemic, supply chains held up remarkably well. And part of that was the lubrication of finance in the system that really helped with that. But, you know, we're still dealing with a storm even now, and there are lots of negative headlines that are influencing the conversation around this. But let's not let that obscure the fact that goods and services are still moving. So perhaps we can talk about where the success stories are and why they are success stories. With that said, there are still plenty of uncertainties, as I'm sure you'll all agree. And the trade finance funding gap is one of those. So we'll deep dive into a little bit more on that and some of the implications and how that's hitting some regions a bit harder than others, which I think some of you will agree. Corporates are still thinking about diversification in sourcing. So we're going to ask what all of this means and how development organizations and financial institutions need to pool their energy to channel the funding to where it is needed. And we have a few existential goals that need to be reached in the coming years, and supply chain management and will be a very, very key part of that. So joining me to discuss all of this, I have a great panel with me. I want to start actually with the person who is joining us online. We have Stephen Beck, Head of Trade and Supply Chain Finance at the Asian Development Bank. Hopefully, Stephen, you can hear me, can you?
Very clearly. Thanks for including me in a virtual way.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. And where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Singapore.
Excellent. Okay, so it's good to have you with us in Singapore. Here with me in the room in Dubai is Ruta, now let me see if I can get this right, Yuk Nevichote, who is joining us from Alpha Tame Group. You are the Head of Governance, Risk Control and Treasury Transformation. And I think from you, we're going to get a great perspective of the real life implications of, you know, when you have a disrupted supply chain and what it means for your business. So thank you very much for joining us today for all of that, Ruta. We also have with us Gwen Mwaba, sitting here to my left, who is the Director of Global Head of Trade Finance at the African Export-Import Bank. I think getting the perspective from Africa is hugely important. And I think everything that's been happening in the world recently has had huge ramifications. So Gwen, welcome. And
Thank you
we're
very
really
much.
looking forward to your insights on the panel today. All the way down there to my left, Mutasim Iqbal, who is Regional Head of TB Sales, AME at Standard Chartered. Mutasim, great to see you. I know from our prior calls and conversations that you have such a broad base of knowledge to talk about the region, but to just talk about the shifting sands in this space. So looking forward to digging in on some of that. And Nicolas Langlois, who actually, I have to say, is the person to thank for pulling all of this together. He's Global Head of Trade Distribution, Credit Structuring and Distribution Group at Standard Chartered. And Nicolas, I'm going to be throwing you in the deep end to begin with, because I thought it would be really interesting just exploring why we wanted to convene this panel in the first place, why we feel that this is such an important topic right now.
Thanks, Manisha. And I'm actually quite amazed to see how many times supply chain finance has already been mentioned this afternoon in a previous panel. And that's, I think, the fascinating aspect of supply chain finance is it's touching every single one of us, either from the corporate perspective or in our day-to-day life. And what's interesting is during the crisis over the past 2 years, being COVID or the conflict in Ukraine, it actually brought to light and revealed the weaknesses of how corporates have built that supply chain model historically. So, whether it's from a logistic perspective, where lack of transportation alternatives, local sourcing have led to those massive congestion in ports, and we still spoke about some of them in China happening right now. And the downward impact on freight cost, delay in shipment, etc. So the logistical aspect has been felt by everyone. And then the other aspect is the way corporate have optimized their supply chain has been primarily around economy of scale, lower cost possible, just in time. And what the consequence of that model has been, it's created some quite heavy concentration as well as hidden interdependencies. So, examples are plenty when you think about the fact that about 25% of the European car manufacturer source their wiring harnesses from Ukraine, which is the first element you have to put in a car, bring all the cable together. Suddenly you understand why it's so difficult to get a car in Europe. It's 3, 6, 9 months delay before you can get a car. So, those interdependencies are actually pushing corporates now to rethink their model. And I'm sure we'll hear from Rota and others on the panel. But that's one of the reasons why it's so important now is that when you stress this historical model, especially for a long period of time, you realize that you need to be much more flexible and change that angle. So that's one aspect. I think the other very topical aspect of supply chain finance is about access, what I call the financial inclusion. The impact that the crisis has had on supply chain finance has been felt not just by large corporate, but also and predominantly by smaller players. So the SME, which are the core of the backbone of the economy. 2 out of 3 newly created jobs on the planet are SME created jobs. And they are the most vulnerable, those that are the most sensitive to those crises, and they actually need the financial support. Now, ironically, they are also the ones who are getting the largest level of rejection in financing, and that's a large part of what the 1.7 trillion trade finance gap that ADB estimates on an ongoing basis and keeps growing actually. That's one of the key contributors. So the collaboration with multilateral organizations in particular who focus on that segment in developing economy, to me is critical in how we address that challenge. And then I will say, the last reason why it's really important is a reason which is by itself important, and we just spoke about it on the previous panel, which is sustainability. I think, when as corporate rethink their model on supply chain finance, they have to take into consideration the impact on the planet, how they select the supplier, and then it's a natural adjustment for financial institution as well to reward the right behavior and to play their role also in terms of how they select the client that they want to deal with, how they select the supplier that they're prepared to finance, etc. So very topical, very timely, and I think the exciting part for me is also it has a purpose. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, you started there by talking about how this is affecting people at all levels. With that in mind, I'll share a personal story, if you'll all indulge me, which was, I haven't traveled for a long time from Singapore, and on the way out, I decided to go to the duty free. But most of the products I wanted to buy were not available. And there were signs everywhere just saying not available. When I asked someone, they said, well, it's because of COVID. Now, I want to follow up on that because is it really because of COVID, Mutassim? I know that you have a long list of issues that are plaguing supply chains at the moment, but I'm curious, is this COVID or is this more?
So I think during the course of the day, we've been talking about all the challenges, and I'd like to put them into 4 broad buckets. There are many other buckets, but let's just put them into 4 broad buckets. So it's COVID, it's conflict, it's containers, and I'll talk about that a bit, and it's commodities, right? And in commodities, you can look at fuel and food prices. So I'll talk briefly about 2 of the C's that I would like to put them in. So the first one is COVID. And if you look at, when we started the year, we all thought that there would be no lockdowns of the sort that we are now seeing in China. And one of the earlier panels spoke about this, right? The kind of last 1 month and a half, March and April, we had a full lockdown in Shanghai. And that's starting to impact supply chains across the world. I mean, if you look at Apple, Tesla, GE Healthcare with their X-ray business as well, but also downstream businesses. You've mentioned duty-free shops, for example. We're talking about construction industry here in this region. Basic, spare parts as well has been a problem. I'll give you my own example recently. I had to get replacement tires for my car. 2.5 years had passed. I went into the market and I just could not find them for like 8 or 9 days. Previously, pre-COVID, I went online, I got the specs I wanted. The guys came to my house, picked up my car. That same day they came and delivered back and was available. This time around, I got them 8 or 9 days later. Everyone cited supply chain concerns, and I didn't get the specs that I wanted. Plus, they were much more expensive. So that's a big concern. The second C that I would like to talk about is essentially around containers, and that's the shipping business, right? And I'll throw some statistics here, all quoted from Financial Times or the Shipping Intelligence Network. 80% of international trade happens on sea. Okay. You today cited earlier on this picture of ships, vessels basically parked outside Shanghai, but not long ago there were vessels parked outside Los Angeles as well. And according to a recent report, almost 15 to 20% of the vessels are basically parked outside these mega ports, trying to wait for getting loaded or unloaded. Various challenges: labor shortages, infrastructure issues, warehousing issues. So in some cases, for example, in Los Angeles, the port authorities did not want to take the goods off the ships because they just did not have a storage space. So these vessels were stuck out there. What that's doing is that it's leading to inflation. According to an IMF estimate, almost 1.5% of inflation this year will be on the back of freight-related costs, right? So given these C's, what are the implications for corporates? And this is what I'd like to talk about a little bit from the perspective of this market. So 3 broad C's. The first one is around, we speak about nearshoring, onshoring. So there's a huge amount of effort that our corporate customers, and I'm sure, Ruta, you'll talk about it in a bit, is they're looking at, because you can't necessarily nearshore or onshore for every single product, right? Some of the components are very sophisticated. You can't just have capacity built overnight. So what a lot of our corporate customers are doing is that they're going out and looking at multiple diversified sources. So if they were buying from 1 or 2 suppliers, they're now buying from multiple suppliers. Okay, that's a big theme that we're seeing. Yes, it's increasing costs, but it's still something that is important from a resilience perspective. The second point is around moving away from efficiency to resilience on inventory management. So previously it was all about just in time. Now it is about just in case. And obviously that leads to an increase in warehousing costs. So warehousing charges have gone up across the region, and that's building into the cost. And inventory holding period is going up, so clients' working capital needs are going up as well. So that's the second big theme. The third big theme, which is quite interesting, is as bankers, when we go out to our corporate clients, in the past, it would primarily be a discussion about their bilateral financing requirements. How do you finance my immediate requirement, my short-term working, my long-term working? Now, the corporate clients are saying, how can you support my SMEs, vendors, to get immediate financing on a fully digitized basis so that my sustainability of the whole working capital is maintained across the ecosystem, not only for myself. Also on the customer side, what we are seeing is that as our customers are basically trying to sell into the market, their clients are asking for extended payment terms. And in return, they come to us for monetization of those receivables from a liquidity and from a risk management perspective. So I think that's the 3 implications that I'd like to talk about. We'll discuss this in more detail as we go on.
Now, forgive me, but I feel suffocated listening to this. I don't know whether any of you would agree. It's intense, actually. And it leaves one with this feeling of, when you're talking about Los Angeles, for example, well, how on earth did, whoever is responsible in that place not have the foresight to see it coming? That is perhaps a question for another day.
Yeah.
And perhaps there are a lot of lessons to be learned here. But as you pointed out, Ruta, I think you've got some really good first-hand experience of exactly how these suffocating restrictions affect businesses and how you manage your way through them.
Yes. Well, at the start of the pandemic, actually, we benefited from our principles just-in-time supply sourcing model. We were able to adjust our orders quickly and reduce pressure on our working capital, so our facilities would stay intact. However, as the situation progressed and we saw, sort of ports are being closed, factories are being closed, or sort of delays in ports. And we also saw shortages in parts. The supply chain landscape changed for us again. Now we were faced with shortages in supply. Some of the ways we try to basically eliminate these issues, we try to plan more in advance. We try to speak to our customers and understand their needs in advance. And also what Motasim has described, we try to order and store the goods so that, whenever the customers are ready, we will be able to sell. For example, in our business in Marks and Spencer's, we were buying next season and keeping it in storage to basically to be able to put it out in stores in time. Some of the logistical issues that we encountered, and we had to address them, we basically had issues with freight forwarders and freight carriers. There was no availability with our current providers. We had to seek out additional providers, the ones that we never used. We had to select companies that were out there in the market, and we had to work together with our business partners to ensure that we select someone reliable and we can trust them. So also we tried to see if we can change freight carriers to freight forwarders, and basically we try to also negotiate contracts with these new providers. We try to see if we can agree long-term contract. However, very quickly on, we realized that even if we agree long terms, we basically, at the time of the shipment, the spots were not available or the terms were not available. So we resorted to seeking weekly quotes from freight companies and basically taking advantage of whatever best rate was available on that day.
Wait, can I just jump in there? So can we clarify, what was the situation before it went to weekly? How would you normally operate?
We had annual contracts, and we usually had the same company providing the same service for us for years and years. Now we had to find companies that would be sort of our panel that we go out to seek the quotes. So it became really sort of hand to mouth.
And it sounds like a real shift in the balance of power in that relationship as well.
Yes. I mean, the rates went jumping up. Like at some points we were paying 4 times, 5 times more what we normally paid. And, we thought that, we will be sort of trying to negotiate sort of more long-term contract, and also to take advantage of having multiple sort of freight forwarders and carriers. However, we realized that, even that situation, spots were very scarce.
Wow. Well, I hope that you have a strong and resilient team around you, because that sounds like a lot to handle. We've talked a bit about the impact with you on businesses. Gwen, let's take it to you, and then we'll go to Stephen. Let's talk about Africa. COVID's still very much on the agenda. This hasn't gone away. Here in Dubai, we don't have to, people aren't wearing masks as much, and we're able to do this in person, which is amazing. But it's not the same situation across the world. Vaccines have been donated, they're being distributed. This is all good news, but in terms of supply chain bottlenecks or suffocations, what are the current challenges that are facing some of the major African economies and the implications of that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think before I even jump into your question, just to give a bit of context around the COVID situation in Africa, Africa CDC still very much is pushing for Africa's vaccination rates to get to 70%, because it's important for Africa to be vaccinated and open up like the rest of the world. I think the only thing that is saving Africa at the moment is that the surges so far have not been as serious as we have seen in other parts of the world. And however, in spite of the donations, in spite of the fact that Africa has access to purchase vaccines through a pooled procurement mechanism that was put in place with the help of the Afrexim Bank and the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Team, we still are seeing very low vaccination rates, an average of 17% across the continent.
Just 17%?
Just 17%. There are pockets of a few countries which have nearly fully vaccinated their adult populations, like Tunisia, for example, and a couple of others. However, the average across the continent is still just 17%. Now, the question is, why is that so when the issue that was there at the beginning of the pandemic, which was access to vaccines, has now gone away, given that there's paid for vaccines and there's donations galore? However, linked to supply chains, the countries can't absorb these vaccines quick enough because they're running out of storage capacity. Infrastructure challenges and shortages in capacity have been a long-age problem in Africa, and this has now come to the fore with actually, countries being able to receive vaccines. So Africa CDC are working very hard to try and help the countries through various mechanisms to increase that absorptive capacity so that the continent can come up. However, when I look at the impact of supply chains beyond the medical and health supplies and facilities, I remember at the onset of the pandemic, the big challenge was scarcity. A mask was costing $50 if you found a supplier that was willing to supply Africa. So obviously that was solved through the setting up of the Africa Medical Supply Platform, which again uses pooled procurement so that they have mass and quantity and can negotiate. Today, the companies then had to respond to that scarcity by repurposing and retooling their factories so that they could produce locally, because it was impossible to shift those goods onto the continent at the right price.
Yeah.
So we saw a lot of companies coming to us to ask for financing so that they could change or move away from their traditional production to start producing hand sanitizers, manufacturing masks, and other PPE. So that solved the health issues. However, in other sectors, and I think if I just cite one example, which is quite stark, exports were also very, very heavily affected because of disruption to supply chains. In the cut flowers market, which is a $13 billion market annually to Africa, we saw wastage and loss of revenues for some exporters by as much as 60%. Because their borders were closed, flights were being cancelled.
Yep.
So all of a sudden, this big source of income disappeared nearly overnight. Auction, they couldn't get their products to auction. And just in closing, what we are seeing now, after looking inwards and companies trying to see whether they could produce locally, those who were producing locally found they couldn't get raw materials. So they shut production. So people lost their jobs. And instead, they started to import finished goods into the continent because the margins were higher, because of scarcity, again, of various products. So what you saw was an increase in food prices across the African continent. And we saw a lot of congestion. I think that was mentioned previously at the ports because of the influx of imports coming in. So lots of congestion at the ports caused by these imports, and even the warehousing facilities around the port areas had no capacity because these goods just weren't moving quick enough. So what we are seeing now, as we've lived through this pandemic into our third year now, is companies are once again saying, look, I can't continue with this import. It's also not efficient. How can we start to produce locally? So we're seeing an increase in demand for imports of equipment and machinery coming back into the continent, but also looking to neighboring countries to source some of that supply. Yeah.
Very interesting. And we'll come back to this question over localization, whether it's a good thing or a bit of a foe. We can look at that in a bit more depth shortly. I want to bring in Stephen, who so patiently is waiting down the line in Singapore. Thank you so much. What about Asia, of course? All of this turbulence, it brings to bear the importance of sustainable supply chains and sustainable trade into sharp focus. I'm putting emphasis on this word sustainable, not necessarily in the ESG framework, but something that is a system that is resilient and can respond with flexibility to all of these challenges. I certainly don't want to feel suffocated, and I'm sure anyone running a business doesn't want to feel that way. And you want to feel that this is running efficiently. Perhaps you could just extend on some of your reflections in the Asian experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by reminding your viewers what Asian Development Bank is. It's a AAA rated multilateral development bank. owned by 60 different shareholder governments. It was created in 1966. And the bank focused primarily on large infrastructure projects with governments in developing Asia and budgetary support. And about 20 years ago, it developed a capacity to work with the private sector. And it's under the private sector area that I work in the trade and supply chain finance program, where we provide guarantees and loans to partners like Stanchart to close some of those market gaps that Nicolas was alluding to. And it's at times like this where there is a fair bit of uncertainty that the market looks to multilaterals like Asian Development Bank, and we've seen that reflected in our volumes in a fairly significant way. So over the past couple of years, our business has grown about 40%. We've done, just last year alone, we did 7,000 transactions supporting $8 billion in trade, and we've seen about a 10% growth on top of that in the first quarter this year. So we're working with banks like Stanchart to close some of these gaps, especially among SMEs in these more underserved markets. But the conversation's been fascinating, and it's an incredible time that we're living through. Truly historical one, especially for trade and supply chains. COVID exposed the weaknesses in trade and supply chains. And now, of course, resilience is an incredibly important topic. In addition to that, now I think we realize that up to 80% of the global carbon footprint can be traced back to trade and supply chains. So in order to meet our climate goals, we're going to have to address that sense of sustainability throughout supply chains, along with the sort of social responsibility aspect. So we're in an incredible time in history. Yes, it is a bit suffocating, as you say, in a way, but it can also be exciting. There is a lot of interesting momentum through partnerships to do things like digitalize global trade and supply chains that can really help us underpin and advance some of these important objectives around resilience, greening, and social responsibility in trade and supply chains.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. And I think one of the things that you said there that's really resonated with me is COVID exposed the weaknesses. Now, actually, I'm getting what you're saying about that actually being a bit of a positive, because it helps you see where the cracks are, and then you know where the work needs to be done. Stephen has already mentioned some of the ways that you address those problems. Nicolas, let's extend on this. I mean, supply chain finance is one of those ways that you keep the wheels moving. And I know that Stanchart definitely stepped up when there was a need to do so during the pandemic. What would you say have been some of those key things that you've learned over the course of the pandemic that need to happen, that you're acting on, and perhaps you have some use cases that you can share? But it's a double-barreled question, because with everything that is positive, one of the issues that we have right now, of course, that interest rates are rising. And I am sure that is causing one of the new challenges on this funding actually happening.
Yes, and actually nothing is becoming easier. As you've mentioned, inflation, food prices, the complexity around the redesign of the supply chain finance or the supply chain of corporate. So that's where I think there is challenges, opportunities, and where financial institutions have a role to play. But in my mind, it's a role that heavily relies on partnership. And the way I see the landscape, it's three pieces to the puzzle. I would say simplicity, flexibility, and also access. When I think about simplicity, I'm looking at the relationship between corporates and bank. Corporates are looking for efficiency in the relationship with banks, and what this has led to is in the space of supply chain, much more momentum in terms of collaboration, by structuring transaction either from a club perspective or syndication perspective. So it's essentially a bank like us, and we've done a number of deals in that way, where we take the lead, we bring other relationship banks of the client, and then we expand that window of opportunity for other participants who don't necessarily have a trade finance business or a supply chain finance infrastructure, but like the risk, like to invest in that asset class, and we bring them along with us. We play the role of the orchestrator. So that collaboration with other banks and that expansion of liquidity into supply chain is a trend that we've seen, and that we continue to play a big role into. So that's the simplification, that one face to the client while providing a wide range of liquidity options. At the same time, we also need to be flexible. And as corporates start, reshaping, the way they interact with their suppliers, we need to have system and capabilities that allows us to reach out to those new players in their supply chain. And again, it's another area of partnership that relies heavily on technology. And there are, technology provider, fintechs, whose main, objective and purpose is actually to develop those solutions. They talk to corporates, they talk to banks, they talk to investor, and they develop solutions which are fit for purpose, but also have the ability to evolve along, the changes in the market. So that's, and they've also understood, by the way, the challenges around banks' infrastructure. So they design solutions which are easily plugged into our system and capability, and that provides that nimbleness in terms of how banks can then follow their client and follow the need of their client. That's the flexibility aspect. And then a very important part of the equation is access and financial inclusion. We need to be able to not just support the large corporates in the resilience of their supply chain at the first level. We also need to get deeper, what I call deep tier financing. So the supplier of the supplier, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. And those are really challenging for banks, in particular from a credit risk profile perspective, from a fragmentation perspective. And that's where the collaboration with multilateral organization is critical. I think I really want to take it to the next level and to a different level of momentum. Moving away, for instance, from name by name assessment, but more portfolio structure, areas which could lead into securitization and bring capital market investors into the equation. So I think there are different ways to look at that collaboration between bank and multilateral organization to really build that resilience of the supply chain, not just the first level of first tier, but the full ecosystem. So that's kind of my take on those three aspects.
Okay, thank you for that. At this juncture, actually, I want to remind our audience, both here in the room and online, that we are receiving your questions. So I think this is a really fascinating topic, which affects all of us, on a very human and day-to-day level. I'm sure there isn't anyone here who hasn't been touched by some kind of supply chain disruption somewhere along the line. And of course, it's so important to your businesses and to this free-flowing financial system that we have. Please do send in your questions. This is your opportunity to hear from a highly esteemed panel of guests that we have today. Ruja, let's extend on this subject that Nicola was raising here about partnerships. We talked earlier about how this balance of power has shifted. But from what you were describing earlier, it was almost that, in those moments, who do you know?
Yes.
Who
Yes,
you networked with?
Exactly. Well, at the start of the pandemic, our biggest issue was ballooning working capital. So we spent days speaking to banks just to ensure that our working capital facilities are intact. I mean, we were shipping goods at the rates that were pre-pandemic level, and at the full lockdown, we were not really able to sell them. So Standard Chartered Bank, one of our key relationship banks, was part of that.
I didn't ask you to say that.
Yes. Also, we actually relied on partnership with our principals. So together with our principal and our key relationship banks, we set up use and sell-C structure that basically reduce pressure on our working capital facilities, especially funded facilities. So that was really sort of a big relief for us. However, as the pandemic-related effects settled in, we started looking at more strategic goals that we can achieve and look at how we can resolve sort of some of the pressing issues, which was basically what we've been discussing. These are our smaller partners, our vendors. So we reached out again to our key relationship banks and started working on supply chain financing program to support our vendors with affordable and accessible financing. Also, we were looking at further digitalization of processes that we have, and mostly now we are trying to focus on digitalization of LCs.
Yeah, it's a fascinating evolution of these relationships, actually. And very briefly, before we move on, how have you found that those partnerships have gone for you? Has that been an easy conversation? Have these partners been forthcoming in making these changes in this way that you both sides have to evolve?
To be honest with you, we had a very good experience with our banks and with our principals. We had enormous support from the banks. To be honest, we didn't have even one bank withdraw the facilities. Even at those really sort of pressured moments, everybody sort of stepped up, and we had sort of a good support from the banks. From the principal's perspective, also we just because our principal sort of had just-in-time model, they were able to adjust our orders quickly, and because it was the biggest sort of the biggest partners that worked on that kind of model, it really made a big effect on us. We saw what happened with some of other principals where, our orders are taken 8 months in advance and we were not able to adjust anything. So we were just receiving shipments. So, actually we realized that having strong relationships really mattered.
Yeah, I think this is a major lesson that's obviously worth sharing. Mudassem, however, this is a success story in a way, in terms of how you launch yourself out of a challenge. But it hasn't always gone that way. In the US, as much as we herald partnership, we're beginning to see major tech companies, major players investing in local sourcing. Now, obviously, the resources exist there for that to happen. And as we will hear later, that isn't the case everywhere in the world. But this, in part, has been spurred, of course, by this anti-China sentiment. There is a crunch when it comes to semiconductors. And this could end up being the Achilles heel. We're talking about the great digital transformation that happened during the pandemic. If you could get your hands on a laptop today, that's quite a thing. I've had a laptop myself repaired recently, but it took 8 weeks to get the screen that was broken by one of my children, to get that fixed. Now, that's unprecedented for me. 8 weeks for a part. Yeah. Again, this is a personal story weaving into a bigger narrative. Should we be worried about this kind of thing?
So it's interesting that you mentioned semiconductors, because we spoke about the 4 C's, right? Conflict, COVID, containers, and commodities. Let's call this chips, right? Because they are chips. This is the 5th C effectively. And really, if you look at your day-to-day life, your Fitbits, your smartphones, computers, both home and workplace. In fact, for those of you who've got teenage kids, graphic cards. My son, we were traveling to the US earlier this year. He said, listen, I don't want to buy anything. I don't want to go to an outlet mall. I just want to get the most sophisticated graphics card so that my gaming works really well. And guess what? That's all powered on semiconductors, right? Yeah. Autos, cars, everything is in the Internet of Things day and age. Everything is powered by a semiconductor or a chip. So that's the other 5th biggest C, if I would like to talk about, right? If you look at the industry, it's in 2021, according to McKinsey, this was a $600 billion turnover business globally. It's going to go to $1 trillion by 2030. And it's all concentrated in a few markets. Taiwan is the biggest manufacturing or fabrication hub for semiconductors. Then it's basically South Korea, China, Singapore to an extent, Japan, and then the US with around 12% capacity. By the way, 30 years ago, US had 39% of capacity. Now it's at this level. So because it's such an integral component of anything that you produce these days, and because of the demand for digital, naturally what companies, manufacturing hubs, and governments for that matter, are saying that we need to bring this closer to home. It's such an important component. However, there are some challenges, right? It's not like a simple component or a simple raw material in which you source like fruit and vegetables, which you can, instead of buying carrots from China, you can start buying carrots from, let's say, close by somewhere, right? This is a very sophisticated one. So according to the Semiconductor Industry Association, you need between 10 to $20 billion to set up a single fabrication unit. And there are very high entry barriers. You need a deep pool of talent, for example, very sophisticated engineers, which are available typically in China, Korea, and Taiwan, obviously very in a big way. And you also need lots of resources, water and electricity. So the barriers to entry are very high. And the reason I give you this background is because the US in December 20 came up with the CHIPS Act. It's called Creating Helpful Incentives for Production of Semiconductors, right? It entails spending $50 billion over the next couple of years to incentivize companies to set up semiconductor plants in the US itself. India recently announced a $10 billion program similar to this, and they've said they can extend it. The first ever deal is being done with a large Indian corporate, Vedanta, and with Foxconn, which is the Taiwanese entity, and they're setting up a semiconductor plant locally. So the reason I mentioned this is because localization, naturally people are looking at it. Your example of your laptop, the screen got damaged. Guess what it's taking? It used to take 21 days to ship from Shanghai to the west coast of the US. Now it can take up to 3 months, 4 months as well. It's such a challenge to get things across. So people are talking about nearshoring, onshoring, simply to build sustainability in the supply chain. I just want to quickly touch upon, if you don't mind, on the supply, because this is really dear to me. And
Sure.
and there are two parts to it, right? So at the outset, you mentioned the gap in financing. And one of the biggest reasons for the gap in financing is that 70 to 80% of your SMEs just don't have access to financing. And even if they get it at a really expensive rate, right? Now with interest rates moving up, it's going to become all the more difficult. So if you look at my sales team, I'm covering across the region. Bulk of our conversation, recurring conversation, is on how we can do supplier financing, supply chain financing, similar to what we spoke to Ruta, across the board, from Pakistan to Southern Africa. This is the biggest issue. And it solves for the financing gap, but it also solves for an important one, which is the S in the ESG, social gap, right? Because many of these companies are not able to get financing, and that is impacting a big part. So to me, a big part of the answer to this is supply financing. Anyways.
Actually, that's a great point at which we can transition to you, Gwen, because I think that's a big issue in Africa, isn't it?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the trade financing gap in Africa is perpetually at between 90 and $110 billion. And as Haitham rightly points out, SMEs are the engine for driving any economy. And that gap is actually majorly made up of SMEs, but they have a very high rejection rate. If they do accept it, as he's rightly pointed out, they're borrowing at astronomical rates. So similarly, one of the solutions from an Afrexim Bank perspective, which is a development finance institution focused on Africa, supply chain financing is one of the platforms that we are looking at to try and narrow that gap by launching supply chain financing in key markets across Africa, hopefully ultimately right across all our member states, but starting in Nigeria, then maybe moving into Kenya in East Africa, we'll pick a country in Southern Africa, so that we identify these anchor buyers, which are typically the larger corporates with a string of SMEs, so that they can benefit from financing by leveraging off the better credit risk and lower rates at which the anchor buyer is able to attract financing.
So it's good to hear that there is a solution and a viable solution. How do you see that evolving?
Well, I guess it's one step at a time. And to my knowledge, I think it's not just Afrexim Bank that is looking to introduce supply chain finance. A number of banks are moving that way. Standard Chartered, Citi, who already have a successful program, but also looking to expand it. But I think more importantly, we also need to start looking at production locally.
Yep.
You know, the dependence on imports for Africa, it just has to stop at some point or be curtailed in some manner, because I think COVID, for one thing, has exposed the vulnerability of the African continent, starting from vaccines, other medical supplies, food, with what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, the dependence on imported wheat, for example, into the continent is coming out of that region, fertilizers. And all of these commodities have seen an astronomical increase in pricing. So we do need to start producing locally. But obviously that won't happen overnight. It does take time. So in the meantime, I think a great opportunity for African countries is the recently launched AFCFTA. There are regions within the continent that are producing some of the goods that some countries need but don't have. So we need to take advantage of the existence of AFCFTA to import products regionally and move away from the dependence of the rest of the world. But the question always remains, well, if I'm importing from one African country to another, I still need to pay in foreign currency.
Yep.
That is a constraint as well. But again, Afreximbank has stepped into that breach and launched a Pan-African Payments and Settlement platform, which enables an importer from one African country to pay for goods in their local currency and the seller in another African country to receive their local currency. This reduces the US dollar component to just the net settlement amount. So that will also help. And I think there are a few other payment platforms that, you know, will emerge and try to solve this problem. And finally, I think one other constraint that the African continent faces with regard to boosting intra-African trade, which has to be the first step, and then we move to more local production, is the lack of information, trade information. People are just not aware of what is available in which markets in Africa.
Yeah.
So once again, through Afreximbank's trade information portal, this type of information is now being made available, because there's no need, for example, to try and import leather hide from New Zealand when you can get it from an African country that has got similar high-grade hide.
Yeah, of course. So there are actually a lot of really good positive stories there about how when you do find out what's wrong with the system, you can build a solution out of it. Let's sort of go with that theme, Stephen, and bring it to you. Let's talk about the Asian experience. How have Asian economies benefited over the last couple of decades from, let's talk about openness and global trade, and now the lessons that we're learning as a result of the pandemic. We've talked about, you know, and you said it yourself about COVID exposing the weaknesses. Well, look, now we've got lots of information to help us build a better future. But how do we do it? And what's your involvement in making it happen?
Yeah, those are great questions. Trade has lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. And, you know, I think we all need to be concerned that and we need to work against this idea of having regional trading blocks. I take the points about having to secure supply routes, supply chains. I hope that doesn't necessarily mean that people draw a conclusion that they need to produce domestically. Of course, I mean, I think that the clear answer has to be around diversification, but that doesn't necessarily mean onshoring. Because I think, you know, if we do end up in trading blocks, we'll all be the poorer for it. And we won't see the kind of growth rates that the world has benefited from as a result of this sort of global trading environment that most, I believe, have benefited over the decades. Then in terms of, you know, ensuring that everyone's included, especially SME segment, I agree that the supply chain finance holds a great deal of promise. We've been talking about supply chain finance for decades, but actually we haven't really moved that far with it. So what are we doing? Well, we're working with banks like StanChart to mutually grow supply chain finance in developing Asia. And that business has been growing. We're still scaling it, but it's been growing very nicely. Two, we're working with the public sector side of Asian Development Bank and governments to introduce legislation that allows for the growth of supply chain finance. Currently, there's sort of a gap in legislation in many countries that impede the growth of supply chain finance. Three, we're working with a number of local banks to provide them with the capacity so that they themselves can start supply chain finance. It's actually a bit complicated and tech-oriented, so we're providing some very intensive sort of training to local banks. And finally, we're working with a number of partners, including StanChart, on developing a white paper to bring deep tier financing. Nicolas alluded to this. This could be very exciting where now by and large supply chain finance involves just the first tier. But what about your supplier's supplier, your supplier, et cetera, down the chain where you get to those smaller companies? And there's a tremendous opportunity through supply chain finance to develop this deep tier financing. It's not easy, but there's really good collaboration in this space, and I'm confident that in the near term, we're going to make it a widespread reality and close some of these gaps.
Thanks for that, Stephen. And very soon we're going to be wrapping up the conversation. But very briefly, I did want to get your comment on one thing. I know the ADB is very puts quite a bit of energy into education and making sure there is understanding and communication around these issues. This is a very simplistic question, but when India shuts down wheat exports and Indonesia says it's not exporting palm oil, and we don't know when that's going to end, can we do more towards raising awareness about options? You can't eat the wheat, switch to millet. There's coconut flour, there's coconut oil. I mean, it's a very simplistic question, but do we need to grow? Do we need to evolve? Do we need to learn?
Well, absolutely. And the Asian Development Bank has been very clear with those governments on those specific issues. We know that it doesn't help. Obviously, there's political pressure and concern about food security in these countries, so one can understand the impulse to implement those kinds of measures. But in the grand scheme, it does not help. And earlier on, people were talking about some of the challenges that we're facing in these uncertain times. I mean, inflation in Asia is projected at 3.7% in 2022. But that really masks where we need to be extremely concerned. Food security. Inflation there, I've read, has been as high as 40%. Energy security has gone up as much as 50%. And of course, it's the poor in society who spend a great deal of their income disproportionately on those kinds of goods. And so we need to be watching this space very closely. We're already starting to see some major disruption, civil unrest, and possibly some political instability. So back to the idea of partnerships, to doing what we can, corporate, financial institution, and government, to ride our way through this bumpy road.
Thanks very much for addressing that question. Now, in a few moments, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just share with me one word that sort of describes the outlook when we're talking about supply chains and just focusing on the subject that we had proposed to us today. So have a think about that. While you're thinking about that, Nicolas, I'm going to give you no time to think about it, because I really just want you to bring everything together. And as we close this conversation, I just want to talk about technology, because everything we're hearing here, yes, partnerships, this is the human connection is very important, but something that has guaranteed efficiency has been the development of platforms. When you talked about platforms which have enabled this, these opportunities between and across borders between countries within Africa, for example. Nicolas, how important are these platforms and the further development of these platforms going to be?
So I think it's the critical element in terms of the realization of the ambition. I think there's a lot of intent, whether it's on, financial access, whether it's on sustainability, etc. But to actually, put it into action and get result out of it, you need those technological aspects. And, Gwen talked about, access to data. From a sustainability perspective, for instance, there's a lot that's required in that space in terms of assessing, mapping, against standards from ESG perspective, packaging product which have differentiated pricing. If you want to bring sustainable investor into the into the supply chain finance, how do you design product which have that element? So to me, the technology aspect is that conduit between the intent and the realization of the ambition. And again, the partnership theme is very prevalent in that aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, when I think about the technology, I think about a show that used to air on National Geographic called Mega Structures. And I remember watching one which was all about container ships and how the system operates and how it's all completely automated. And that was remarkable. That was a decade ago. So this is a kind of, the flow of the technology over time. Well, look, I have to wrap up now. It's been a really engaging, fascinating conversation. And thank you all for sharing your personal stories, because I think it can resonate with many of us in the audience. We've all been touched by this issue. And I wish you all luck in solving this problem, because, it's good to know that this is the bread and butter for some of you, for a situation that affects us all. I'm going to get that one word that describes the outlook now. I'm going to start with Stephen, because he's been so patient throughout this, being our lone ranger out there in Singapore. Stephen, how would you describe the outlook in one word or up to a sentence, please?
Oh, I didn't know I had the option of the sentence. I'll go with opportunity.
Oh, that's great. That's a nice positive one. Thank you so much for that, Stephen. That's Stephen Beck, Head of Trade and Supply Chain Finance at the Asian Development Bank. And now to my left, Gwen Mwaba.
So for me, it has to be intra-African trade.
Okay, all right, give me the liberty of 3 words. That's good. Yeah, and actually some of the ideas and the developments that you've presented today have been really encouraging. So, good luck pushing all of that. Gwen is, a reminder, the Director of Global Head of Trade Finance at the African Export-Import Bank. Thank you for your contribution today. We will go to Ruta. Positive, brilliant. I'm really glad we're ending on an up here. Just a reminder, Ruta is the Head of Governance, Risk Control and Treasury Transformation at Alpha Tone Group. And it's been fascinating today to hear some of that behind the scenes insights on how you've dealt with the crisis, and good luck for the future as well. Nicolas, what is your word?
I would say connectivity.
Okay, very apt, given your last contribution there. A reminder that Nicolas is the Global Head of Trade Distribution, Credit Structuring and Distribution Group at Standard Chartered. And finally, but by no means least, Mutasim.
Well, Stephen took my word, but I'll go with agility.
Agility.
Yeah.
I like that one. I think that encapsulates actually a lot of what we've been talking about.
To respond to the crisis. Yeah. And we are sitting in Dubai, which is really good at dealing with crisis situations and turning it into an opportunity. And I think that's what Stephen said, so we need to look at it that way. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you as well. Mutasim Iqbal, Regional Head of TB Sales AME for Standard Chartered.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you all, our audience in the room and online.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we have one more panel coming up today. We're going to be talking about funding liquidity. Is the tide turning for bank issuances? Let's just take a couple of minutes. Please don't go too far. I will be back to moderate the next panel. Thanks, guys.